Hey guys, this is one of those rare occasions where I have a repeat guest. Today I have with me one of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, Dr. David Buss. Hey David, how you doing?
Hey, pretty good.
It, it's so good
Yeah.
to... Go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I was just thinking about how long we've known each other. And I remember meeting you at the HBS conference in London, which was 20 years ago, I believe. Now, I might have met you before that, but that's my first memory
That
of
is
meeting
the...
you in person.
Well, thank you for remembering because that meeting should be a lot more memorable to me than to you, given our differing statuses back then. Some might argue even today. It was in 2001. It was at UCL, University College London.
Right.
It was at the HBS meetings that year, and I was giving a talk on, mating issues, specifically information search and mate choice, which was very much within my wheelhouse because my doctoral dissertation was on when is it that you've acquired enough information to stop acquiring additional information and commit to a choice. So I looked at
Yeah.
stopping strategies. And in the back of the room sitting were David Buss, Margot Wilson, Martin Daly, Lida Cosmides, and John Tooby. And I had come up to you guys, and you were all unbelievably gracious. And I thought, this is unbelievable. I'm meeting all of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology. How did I do in that talk? Do you remember it all? Was I
Oh,
okay?
yeah, I thought you gave a great talk. Um,
Aren't you gracious?
so, and obviously have had a very illustrious career since then.
Thank you so much. I wanted to give folks a bit of your bio. It would take several hours to go through the whole details, but let's go through just some highlights. I wrote them down here. So, as I said, you're one of the pioneers of EP. EP, of course, is short for evolutionary psychology. You're currently a professor of psychology at the University of Texas, Austin, where a lot of my friends from Southern California are moving to. You
Right.
you previously held professorships at Harvard University and the University of Michigan. I've got a great personal story regarding the University of Michigan. We can get into it in a bit. And now this is the part that really shot my testosterone levels really down. Google Scholar citations 81,524. Your H index as of today is 120. For people who don't know what these numbers are, they're astonishingly high. You were indeed a guest of mine 5 years ago,
Right.
and I checked the like to dislike ratio. I think we did pretty well, David. 995 likes to 15 dislikes. I'm assuming all 15 dislikes come from women's studies programs. Uh, some of your books, now your edited books are not listed here, but these are your author or co-authored books. The one that first introduced me to you, The Evolution of Desire, Strategies of Human Mating, The Dangerous Passion, Why Jealousy is as Necessary as Love and Sex, Evolutionary Psychology, The New Science of the Mind, The Murderer Next Door, Why the Mind is Designed to Kill, Why Women Have Sex, Understanding Sexual Motivations from Adventure to Revenge, co-authored with Cindy Meston. And today's book that we'll be discussing, your most recent book, When Men Behave Badly, The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault. So I guess we would start with the current book. Give us the big synopsis. We'll drill down and then take it wherever we need to go.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, this is just for people. This is a cover of the book in case they don't see it. I thought it's a very nice cover that my publisher did. So basically, the book is about conflict between the sexes, and which has, as you know, Gad, a very long and deep evolutionary roots. I mean, it goes back to sexual reproduction itself, which is estimated to be about 1 to 2 billion years ago. So once you have two sexes evolving, then the bottom line is that a strategy that is optimal for one sex is not necessarily optimal for the other sex. And so you have sexual conflict theory, or in technical terms, it's called sexually antagonistic coevolution, where adaptations in one sex inflict costs on the other that create selection pressure for defenses to prevent those costs being incurred. And like predators and prey, there's this coevolutionary arms race. So not between species, as in predators and prey, but rather within species between the sexes. And basically what I do is I use this framework, sexual conflict theory, as the overarching framework to understand conflict between the sexes. And so I examine conflict between the sexes at 3 stages of the mating process. So on the mating market is first, as people enter the mating market. So things like deception about what mate qualities you might have, and we know that online dating deception occurs, or feigning a long-term mating strategy when, in many cases, the men are actually pursuing a short-term mating strategy is another example. Then I move to sexual conflict within relationships, and I've studied married couples, dating couples, and there's not a single couple I've ever encountered that has zero conflict. But I go through the evolutionary logic of the sorts of conflicts that couples get into over sexuality, over infidelity, over even what I call financial infidelity, where it turns out an astonishingly large number of people have secret bank accounts, secret credit cards, conceal resources from their partner, conceal where the resources are going. And so you have sexual infidelity and financial infidelity and a whole host of other sources of conflict. And then also, as you know, couples break up. There's a divorce rate. There's dissolution. And so I talk about the causes of those, the conflicts that emerge around the breakup, and then conflict in the aftermath of a breakup. So things like stalking and revenge porn occur. And then I have, so I'm kind of going through the chapters of the book very quickly as an overview.
Sure.
Then I have 2 big chapters on sexual coercion. And these include things like sexual harassment, unwanted sexual attention, all the way to sexual assault. And I have 1 big chapter on the underlying male psychology of sexual assault and sexual harassment, and then 1 big chapter on women's evolved defenses, of which there are about a dozen or so that would surprise people. And some are effective, some are ineffective. We can get into those if that's a topic that interests you. And then the final chapter, I kind of bring it all together. The final chapter is called Mind the Sex Gap. And this is something I think, Gad, you might resonate with. Now, to my astonishment, there seems to be a movement of what I call sex difference denialism. This notion that somehow there aren't any sex differences, and it's just astonishing to me because the scientific evidence is overwhelming that there are. The sex differences that I talk about in the book, When Men Behave Badly, are among the largest in magnitude and the most replicable in the entire field of psychology. And so how people try to deny these, perhaps for ideological reasons, or perhaps they worry that if we admit that women and men differ in any way, that will cause discrimination against women, which of course it doesn't. And what I argue in the book is that in this case, sex difference denialism harms women. And we can get into the reason for that. So the last chapter of the book, just to conclude on this, is basically how can we use this information to reduce conflict between the sexes.
Got you. Well, of course, you are indeed right that this whole denialism issue is well within my wheelhouse. I mean, the parasitic mind is all about idea pathogens that cause us to engage in disordered thinking. Social constructivism in its radical form would be one such idea pathogen. Biophobia, the fear of using biology to explain some human phenomena, would be another one. So yes, of course. Now, you hinted at one of the reasons why that form of astonishing denialism might happen. If we don't adhere to the narrative that men and women are indistinguishable other than because of social construction, then that might remove our ability to eradicate the sexist patriarchal status quo. Therefore, if we need to murder truth in the service of this laudable goal, so be it. Are there other reasons that you could think of, whether it be specifically in your area of interest, in mating and sex differences, or in other areas, that explain why people are so prone to, as I call in my book, ostrich parasitic syndrome. What causes this kind of astonishing denialism?
Yeah, well, I think it actually comes from so this has been a bit of a change in my own thinking. So I think it comes from political ideology, at least in part, where I used to think that those on the right were science deniers, and I think that they are or can be with respect to certain issues. But what I came to realize is that those on the political left are science deniers of a certain sort. That is, they're very selective in what sorts of science they deny. So, for example, those on the ideological left are more likely they accept evolutionary theory in principle, but they chop it off at the neck. So they think, well, it hasn't affected our brains and our minds. And then there's also a science denialism around sex differences. And in particular, the domain that I study are sexual psychology, and this is, I'm not sure quite how far back this goes, but I think I'm old enough to have a dim memory of the sexual revolution back in the late 60s, early 70s. I was too young, unfortunately, to
partake in it.
But I observed it and read about it, and part of the movement was that women should behave sexually just like men. And what they found is, so there was a kind of shift toward promiscuity during that sexual revolution. But what women found is that they weren't as comfortable with it as men, that they would have, casual sexual experiences with strangers and not feel great about it, not feel good about themselves afterwards. So I could think maybe, but part of the movement was that somehow women should be identical to men in their sexual psychology, and the fact is they're not. I mean, we know there are very predictable differences that we can get into.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so much to drill down on. Since last we spoke, so I think it was in April 2016, we're now 5+ years later. What are some major differences that have taken place as relating to anything EP? Now, that could be greater acceptance of EP in the social sciences, lesser, hysterical reticence within the public engagement against EP. If you're EP-er, you're a Nazi, you're a patriarchal pig, and so on. New findings that completely negate some of the stuff that you and I would have agreed to 5 years ago. So give us, to the best of your abilities, 2, 3, 4 things that when we spoke in April 2016 would not have been as true or would have been different from something today.
Yeah, well, one of them is precisely what we've been talking about. I mean, when I first started studying sex differences and found how large and replicable they were, and this is now several decades ago, I thought, well, surely over time, the science people will come to accept these because they're irrefutable from a scientific perspective. So one of the things that surprised me over the last 5 years is this sex difference denialism. Now, I don't think it comes from all quarters. So I think it maybe is just the extreme or fringe views that have the sex difference denialism. So like as an example, there have been these recent books, and I'm sure you're aware of those, that claim that there are no differences in brains between males and females. Right. And I talked to neuroscientists who actually know about the brain, and they find it laughable. But the book that claimed this won some award, like
I know that this is the Daphne something from Israel. Is that the woman?
I don't recall the name or the title, but these books seem to be very popular with people. The message, it turns out we were all wrong. It turns out male and female brains are identical, and and it's just it's kind of laughable, and so I guess I just wouldn't have expected the receptivity to that kind of message, which is so against what we know scientifically. So
this I think that they call it neurosexism, right? I mean, using using some anatomical metric where you compare men and women, and there is no difference on this particular metric, therefore male and female brains are the same. And so I have satirized this, as I often do, the tsunami of stupidity, by saying we are looking for a dog as a pet. And this is why we just adopted a giraffe, because dogs have 4 legs and a giraffe has 4 legs. Therefore, we need to rearrange our house because the dog that we've gotten, the giraffe, is simply too tall for our house. But since they have a tail, they have 4 legs, they have 2 eyes, they're the exact same species. Does that not exactly cover the level of thinking of those who argue that there are no anatomical differences between the sexes when it comes to the brain?
Yeah, that's a good one, and that's a hysterical example. I like your sense of humor about these things. That really adds, and kind of makes the point, in a way that just logical argument wouldn't necessarily make the point as effectively.
That's why satirists are despised historically by despots, because despots are a lot more afraid of guys that have big brains and sharp tongues than guys with big muscles. Big muscles, we can deal with them. But the guy who's got the incisive tongue, that guy is dangerous. We need to shut him up. Okay, so let's get into some of the details. So you gave us a fantastic synopsis. I wish my students could learn how to come up with such a succinct and clear summary when it comes to the elevator story of the work. So if we look at perpetrators, so the part in your book that resonates most with the hashtag #MeToo movement, the sexual coercion part and the sexual assault and so on, I think you talk about the dark triad, which we can certainly get into: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. So let's hold on that. We're going to talk about it. But what are some other traits, predictors, that can help us understand who is likely to be a sexual coercer, a sexual offender, a sexual harasser? Do we have a sense beyond the dark triad of who that guy is?
Yeah, well, so I think there are general features of male sexual psychology, but individual differences occur in each of these. So one is the male desire for sexual variety. So that is for a variety of different sex partners, and this is one of the largest and most replicable sex differences in the domain of sexual psychology, where how many sex partners would you like to have in the next 5 years? Men want a lot more than women. How many sexual fantasies do you have about different women? One thing I sometimes say is men can walk down a crowded city block and have brief sexual fantasies about half a dozen women in that one block. Women's sexual fantasies tend to be different. Women are more likely to fantasize about a guy they're romantically involved with or would like to become romantically involved with, and they don't spread it as widely, their sexual fantasies. Or even during the course of a single fantasy episode, men do more partner switching during the course of their sexual fantasies than women. Time elapsed before seeking sexual intercourse. So you meet someone, you're having a positive interaction. How long do you wait before seeking sex? Men prefer to wait a shorter amount of time. Women prefer to wait a longer amount of time. How much psychological and emotional investment do you prefer before you're comfortable having sex? One of the classic items that assesses this is, as you know, the sociosexual orientation inventory. But one of the items on that, which has always amused me, is sex without love is okay. And it's an attitude statement. Men tend to agree with that. Women tend to disagree with that. But I always thought that a linguist might think, well, it could be interpreted as sex without love is just okay, or rather, sex without love, yeah, that's really okay. Right. So it could be interpreted differently. But that's one that also shows a large sex difference, where literally men are on one side of the agree with that, and women are on the disagree side of that.
And you forgot to perhaps mention, but of course you're very aware of the classic studies where you just approach men and women and say, hey, right now we go to my apartment, let's have some nice sex, and the ones who do the approaching are physically attractive, whether they be men or women. And yet, most men say, yeah, great, I just hit the lottery. Whereas most women, it doesn't matter how good looking the guy is, are unlikely to acquiesce to such a tantalizing offer, correct? And it's been replicated, I think now. The first one was maybe late 70s, right?
The first study was 1989 on it, Clark and Hatfield. And that study found that in that condition, hi, I've been noticing you around, I find you very attractive, would you have sex with me? That study found that 75% of the men said yes to sex and 0% of the women. And subsequent replications and attempts to deal with confounds have, they replicated it, but you can get women off the 0%. So you can get a few percent of women saying yes if the guy's like really good looking and very charming. But still then, if the woman is really good looking and really charming, then the men go up to like 83%. So the sex difference is robust. Yeah, it's been replicated in half a dozen or so different cultures, including very sexually egalitarian cultures over in Europe, like Denmark, France, I believe, Germany, and some others. So yeah, it's a very replicable sex. So and all these findings, they converge on this notion that desire for sexual variety, as you can say, is the underlying core of that, and the sexes just differ profoundly on that. And I think this is one of the causes, combined with the higher sex drive, that men are more motivated to seek sex. So that's part of it. Now, some more than others. There are individual differences.
Of course.
There's another tick in, some call it a bug, or it could be a design feature, I think, is the male sexual overperception bias. So the classic one is,
she smiled at me, she wants to have sex with me.
Yeah, she smiled at me. That's like, and then she casually brushed against my arm as she passed. That's like a no-brainer. She absolutely wants to have sex. And of course, we know that smiles are, it's really interesting because smiles are inherently ambiguous cues. They could indicate sexual interest, or they could be mere friendliness, or they could be politeness, or they could be nervousness because the guy's a creep. So, but men tend to infer more sexual interest than is there, at least according to women. But some men are more prone to this sexual overperception bias. So it's not all men are equally susceptible. So men high on narcissism, which you mentioned earlier, is one of the dark triad traits, and also men who are pursuing a short-term mating strategy, that is, men who dispositionally tend to pursue a short-term mating strategy. That combination, these men are especially likely
because I need
for sexual interest.
I need to have that perceptual bias in order to instantiate that short-term mating strategy. It's kind of like if the challenge hypothesis, if you challenge me, I need to have a preparatory rise in my testosterone level to be able to meet your challenge. So if I put on my rose-colored perceptual lenses of detecting every woman who looks at me as wanting to have sex with me, that makes perfect sense if I'm seeking short-term mating. It's as simple as that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I would add to that, is that some men are shy or inhibited about approaching women. And if you literally believe that she is really interested in you, that's going to help overcome that shyness or inhibition. It gives you you're saying, she's giving me the green light to approach. And one of the examples I use, so these men literally do believe that the women are attracted to them. And I use the example in the book of a former senator of the U.S. Senate, Bob Packwood, who wrote in his journal about these women. I knew she wanted me because otherwise why would she be in the copy room just when I was there, admiring my bulging biceps and so forth. And anyway, he was accused by 20 different women of sexual harassment, and ended up resigning before the Senate, convicted him of this. But it kind of illustrates the point that these men literally believe that the women are attracted to them, right. And that leads to in the workplace sexual harassment. It's one of the contributing factors anyway.
Well, in the inability to speak each other's language, by each other I mean across the sexes, is very interesting in many different domains. So I recently had a chat with a former porn star. Her stage name is Eva Lovia, and we were talking about, forgive the sort of the vulgar colloquialism, dick pics. And what I was arguing there is that, you know, the reason why men send those pictures to women under the assumption that that's going to arouse them is because they are lacking, in this case, a sex-specific form of theory of mind. Because I'm speaking now as a man, if I get aroused by sexual visual stimuli, then it must imply that women are equally prone to be titillated by that visual stimulus. That's why I send those pics. I mean, and that's why you've got all the politicians who engage. So it literally is a form of poor mind reading of the other sex that causes a lot of these cross-channel problems, right?
Yes, exactly. And I use that example. I go over the research on dick pics, and that's one of the key points that I make in the book, is that, you know, it's a kind of a fascinating issue, in that we are stuck in the interior of our own minds and brains, you know, and so we consult our intuitions about our own sexual psychology to infer the sexual psychology of others. And as you point out, it exactly leads to these predictable forms of mind reading errors. And that's why I think that, and so the studies show, to get back to the dick pics, so that most women find these gross, right. And men, at least a proportion of men, think that the women are going to be, oh wow, I'm really
that's impressive. Yes,
you know, bring it on. But most women find them gross. A small percentage of women find them attractive, but most find them gross. And so that's an example. It's a perfect example of a failure at sexual mind reading.
I'll give you one example of that from my own research. This was a 2003 paper that I had written at the time with one of my former doctoral students, where we were looking at sex differences in gift giving. And in one part of the study, we asked men, you know, what are the reasons that you think that women give you gifts? And we asked the same question of women in a romantic context. And the gift motives were of two types: either situational, so it's because it's his birthday, that's a situational, or I'm trying to seduce her, I'm trying to exhibit generosity, right? Well, It turns out that men thought that the reasons why they give gifts for tactical reasons to women, I want to seduce her, I want to have sex with her, is the exact same reason that women give gifts to men. So if I receive a gift from a woman, it must be because she wants to have sex with me. Whereas women were very aware of the difference in motive. So women could mind read, men could not. And I argued in the book, I mean, speculatively, because we didn't have data to look at, but from an evolutionary perspective, it made sense for men to not have evolved the capacity to read those subtle differences, because it prepares me to just constantly approach women and so on. Whereas if women had not evolved, so sort of to go with your first point about the co-evolution, an arms race between men and women, if every woman were duped by a guy who said, here's a flower, I want to be with you forever, let's go in the back of the shed and have sex, if she couldn't read those signals, then it wouldn't be to her best interest, right? So there are evolutionary pressures in some cases for men and women to have different abilities to engage in theory of mind.
Yes, yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And for precisely the reason that you allude to, that is, in the book, I call it basically violation of female choice. You know, that as I regard female choice, and it comes from Darwin's theory of sexual selection, is one of the first laws of mating, you know, possibly the first law of mating. And so women have adaptations to preserve freedom of sexual choice, and accurate sexual mind reading might indeed be one of them. However, just to add a perhaps counter example to that, in our studies of speed dating, so we did this lab study of speed dating. Karen Perilou, one of my former graduate students, spearheaded this. But one of the interesting things that we found, so we had men and women come into the lab, interact with someone and then rate, is this person interested in you? How interested are you in that person? And then they rotate partners. And so we were able to get actual interactions. And one of the things that we found, in addition to the male sexual overperception bias, which is particularly true of these narcissistic short-term maters, is that women tended to underperceive men's sexual interests. So that as the guys were saying, oh yes, I'm very sexually interested in her, and we asked the woman, this guy that you just interacted with, is he interested in you sexually? And they would say, no, there are no indications of that. And so, but I think that it's the first finding of its sort, and I think there are different interpretations. So one interpretation might be that men are suppressing the overt display of sexual interest, because if you are interested in sex, the worst strategy you can do is be explicit about it. That is, other tactics like displaying cues to long-term commitment, or you find the woman so fascinating and deeply psychologically interesting, are much more effective than explicitly sexual signals. So one interpretation is men are suppressing the expression of overt sexuality, and so women are not getting the relevant cues. Another, though, might be a female defense of literally not seeing it. So as a defense against unwanted sexual attention, they just don't see it, that it's, and so in essence kind of ignoring it, except perhaps at a subconscious level. And so which of these interpretations or alternative ones, or which combination is correct, we still don't know.
The former one would fit nicely with one of the three traits in the dark triad, Machiavellianism, right? So that if I were doing what you said in the first explanation, which is to willfully suppress my interest because of some ulterior motive, would that fit as a instantiation of Machiavellianism?
Possibly.
Okay.
Possibly. I don't know. I think that given, maybe especially in the current environment with the Me Too movement and awareness, it might be that men are generally inhibited about expressing sexual interest more so than in previous eras. But whether Machiavellians are more likely to suppress than just the average guy, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question.
Maybe this might be finally a time where we actually collaborate on a paper, David.
Yeah, that would be great. I would very much like that.
You're very kind. Remember earlier I asked about what are some predictors other than the dark triad that might explain some of the creepy guys that engage in this kind of behavior. Could it be something as simple as how I score on my either true objective mate value or my perceived mating value? So my perceived is I have low self-confidence, so I don't think I have high mating value, even though the reality is I do have mating value. So for example, someone like Harvey Weinstein, you might argue he had high mating value in that he's a very successful, powerful, high status film producer, but you might argue that on some other metrics, like with all due respect to Harvey Weinstein, he doesn't exude. You kind of want to wash him, right? He doesn't exude he's not the prototypical gorgeous man.
Right. He's not George Clooney.
He's not George Clooney, exactly. Is that something that you've looked at, or if we haven't looked at it, could that be a predictor of, if I'm truly the top dog, I don't need to engage in coercive tactics, because as we know, the main thing that establishes how many women I have sexual access to potentially is if I score very high in terms of my mating value. If Harvey Weinstein, for whatever reason, scores lowly, he has to resort to these strategies in lieu of pursuing less coercive one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. I get into that in a somewhat different form in the book under what's called the mate deprivation hypothesis, which Randy Thornhill and others were the first promulgators of. And I think there might be something to that, but I actually think there's a ton of evidence against it. So I think with respect to Harvey Weinstein, it's a fascinating example, and I talk about him in the book to some degree. Yeah, from a physical standpoint, women don't find him that desirable, but from a status and power perspective, they are. We know women are attracted to men who are high in status and are very powerful. And as he used, one of his tactics is, I could make your career or break your career. And he would say, like, show me your breasts. And the woman would say, no, I don't want to show you. And he said, I can make your career or break your career. Now show me your breasts. And so he was quite a bit of a bully. And this gets back to a key point, a serial sexual harasser or sexual predator, I would say, because went way beyond sexual harassment in many of the cases. To sexual predation, sexual assault. And one of the interesting things with that is that one thing we don't know about his case is how many women gave in to it. So we've heard from a lot of women who said, no, I refused, and then he tried to blackball me. But how many women actually did sleep with him under those coercive conditions? We don't know. And we also do know that some women, and our studies have found this, some women do use sex to get ahead in the workplace. A minority of women, but there are some that do that.
Okay, now, in the same way that I asked about the likelihood that someone would be the sexual predator as a function of their mating value, is there any research that looks at how women perceive the exact same behavior as a function of the metrics of the person emitting that behavior? So, for example,
yes,
I am the beautiful Italian, kind of to be stereotypical, who approaches you and, quote, harasses you, but in Italy it's called every day. As you walk down the street, there's someone who's trying to seduce you. That becomes a charming, seductive strategy that actually increases my sense of worth as a woman if it is the glorious, gorgeous Italian guy doing it to me. Whereas the exact same behavior, I don't change a single, micro action. If it is done by someone that I find despicable for whatever reason, it then gets coded as a violent sexual assault on the street. Has there been research on that?
Yeah. Actually, my lab has done a bit of research on it, and I report it in greater detail in my previous book, The Evolution of Desire, which you were kind enough to mention. But yeah, what we did is we kept the act the same. So made unwanted sexual advances or persisted in sexual advances even after you said no. And we varied. Is this guy a janitor? Is he a professor? Is he a rock star? Is he a successful businessman, and so forth? And we found women. We asked how harassing would this be, and how upset would you be? And what we found is that it indeed varied, in part with the social status of the man. Amazing. So the same act by the janitor is not warmly received. So.
And is it social status that's the key, driver of that effect, or could it be whether I am physically very of course, from an evolutionary perspective, I would expect social status to be greater. But do other variables serve as moderators, including my physical attractiveness?
Yeah, I would expect that they would, but we didn't look at physical attractiveness in that particular study. But that's a prediction I would make as well.
Yeah, got you. Do you worry, David, that because you mentioned Randy Thornhill, whom we both know very well, he wrote a book with, if I remember, Palmer in the early 2000s on the sort of evolutionary roots of rape. And I remember I had been invited by the gang at the University of New Mexico, including Jeffrey Miller and Gengestead and all those guys. And I had gone out, hanging out with Randy Thornhill, and I had asked him, this was 2006, I think it had been maybe 5-6 years since his book had come out, and I said, so how, what are some of the worst stories that you can recount in terms of the reception that you had gotten in writing that book? And he said, well, at one point I had to have sort of police escort, if I remember the details of what he had responded, because people were so irate, again, falsely thinking that if you explain a phenomenon, you're condoning it and justifying it. Do you worry, for similar reasons, that people will come after you? Oh, so you're offering a fancy schmancy evolutionary explanation for men's poor behaviors. Clearly, you are justifying and condoning it.
Yeah, well, I think at this point, I'm not. It did concern me as I was writing the book, but I think that that the way I handled it, and people who actually read the book, that they won't feel that way, because I do take pains to point out precisely the fallacious reasoning that you mentioned. That is, in order to eliminate these bad behaviors like sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual coercion, we have to understand the causes. But identifying the causes, the analogy that I give is, if you're a cancer researcher, that doesn't mean you think cancer is a good thing and we want to have more.
I give the exact same analogy.
Okay, so well, maybe I heard you, and I actually cite someone else. I can't remember who it was. Maybe Shackelford, who other people have used that example. But yeah, no. So obviously explaining and identifying the causes of the bad behavior does not in any way excuse it or justify it. But in fact, just the opposite. It provides ammunition for eliminating it. Just like understanding the causes of cancer will lead to, and have led to, some interventions to mitigate it.
So that example is one of many attacks that detractors of EP will use against EP. Oh, you're trying to condone it. You're trying to justify it. Biological determinism. I mean, in one of my previous books, I list a whole bunch of these, and since I have updated the list, and I know that you've also looked at that. So, and I asked you earlier, in the last 5 years, have things changed in EP? So if we look at all of the classic, let's pick the top 10 cognitive and emotional obstacles as to why people, have that visceral disgust of EP. Have we made any headway, do you think? Or is it... Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we have. I mean, it's hard to tell trends, but I think that part of what's helped, part of the initial reaction is just it's so novel. As you know, and well, I've argued, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think evolutionary psychology is actually a scientific revolution.
It is.
And I think we're in the midst of it. And I think it's the most important scientific revolution, at least in the field of psychology, or I would say all of social sciences. And this may sound grandiose, but my view is any field that deals with human behavior has to deal with evolved psychology that in part causes that behavior. And so even fields like sociology, or in your domain in the business school, consumer research, organizational behavior, all these things have as their foundation our evolved psychology, and so we have to understand that. So I think that I think there's been progress. I think there are, for example, textbooks in the field of psychology that do acknowledge and recognize the findings, some of the sex differences. I think also there's been an explosion of research on cooperation and morality. And I think maybe that has helped, because it's like it used to be the stereotype was, EP just focuses on sex and violence. They're obsessed with sex and violence. And but in fact, there's been an explosion of research on cooperation and morality. And so, however, I would defend the focus on sex because in sexually reproducing species, everything has to go through mating.
Right.
And ultimately, and so a lot of phenomena that even might seem distantly related are in fact tributary to mating and sexuality. So things that we've talked about like status, but also other things like coalitional psychology, through different links are related to mating. And so I think it's not a bad thing that there has been a lot of focus on sexuality and mating, because it's so important. If we were an asexual species, we wouldn't have to worry about it. We'd focus on other things, but we're a sexually reproducing species.
But do you think, I want to come back to all the list of detractors in a second, but since you're defending the penchant to focus on human mating, you're sort of preempting one of my next line of questions. Okay. So in my next book that I'm currently working on, one of the chapters I talk about variety seeking, but variety seeking could be sexual variety seeking in the a la EP sense. It could be tourism destination variety seeking. It could be food variety seeking. Mm-hmm. And one of the areas that I focus on as an instantiation of variety seeking is intellectual variety seeking. Mm-hmm. And I argue that, so for example, I am a big intellectual buffet guy. In other words, and maybe, not maybe, I think almost guaranteed to the detriment of my academic metrics. I mean, not that I give too much damn about it at this point, but, if you were advising your graduate students, you'd say, focus on one area and go very deep, and through economies of scale, pump out a paper that's plus epsilon every year. And that's the way that you're going to kind of be recognized as having planted a flag somewhere. Whereas I'm someone who publishes in medicine on Munchausen syndrome by proxy while being housed in the business school. Because if I'm interested in a phenomenon, if David Buss comes to me and says, hey, do you want to work on this GAD? And if it sufficiently titillates my curiosity, I'm in to a fault without caring about strategizing. And so I'm a grand intellectual variety seeker. Whereas, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, you would, I think, be prototypically in the other range, which is, yes, of course, you've studied a million different instantiations within mating, but, you are the world foremost guy in mating. Do you ever, is that a tension for you? If you had to look back at your career, would you change and buffet from more intellectual landscapes? Or anywhere you want to take this question, take it away.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Gad. I guess I would say, well, first of all, I think both types of scientists are needed. Okay, we need people who have these broad views, because you can link different topics that otherwise wouldn't be linked, and
Consilience.
Yeah, and so I think we need both types. I guess I would say I'm kind of a cross between those two types. So yes, I've studied mating and death more than any other thing, but I've also studied homicide, which turns out to be related to mating, motives for murder. I'm currently studying status, the underlying psychology of status. But again, that's linked to mating in various interesting ways, but is somewhat different. And so I guess what I would say is, kind of getting back to an earlier point of mine, that you can run, but you can't hide from mating. So that it's even part of the reason I wanted to study homicide, why people kill, is to branch out, move away from mating domain. But what I found is that motives for murder are heavily mating related, directly or indirectly. So for example, in the indirectly, as you know, men and Martin and Margot, Daly and Wilson have documented this. Men kill over status. They kill if they're publicly humiliated. Well, you may think that has nothing to do with mating. Well, in fact, it does. Our status and reputation, if that plummets, then you become invisible to women. And so it's not, and so the point that I'm making is that one of the things that fascinates, so I'm a fairly broad-minded intellectual or professor as well. Perhaps not, I've never studied Munchausen by proxy, or maybe some of the other things that you've studied. But I guess what I do have is that core base, the mating base, and all the topics that I've studied turn out to be also related to it in one way or another, such as murder and status.
Yeah, by the way, I mean, you mentioned earlier, just now, Daly and Wilson, and I think we discussed this the last time you were on my show. It was their book, Homicide, that got me into EP, because it was in a first semester doctoral course with it was an advanced social psychology course. So I was trained, my doctoral supervisor is a mathematical and cognitive psychologist by the name of Jay Russo. Actually, his PhD is from University of Michigan in psychology. And he had suggested that I take a course in advanced social psychology. So this was not an EP course. It was 1990 at the start of really EP. And about halfway through the course, the professor's name was Professor Dennis Regan. He assigned the book Homicide by Daly and Wilson, and my mind was blown. And then I said, okay, well, I'll apply this framework in studying consumer psychology, and that's how it was made. And I think I had asked you this last time around, but maybe it's worth repeating. What was your evolutionary bug moment, your epiphany? Was it you were in a bookstore and you saw some book? Was that
there was a series, but it actually started as an undergraduate when I read a book that no one knows about these days called The Imperial Animal.
Desmond Morris?
No, it was Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox.
Yes.
1971, and I read that as an undergraduate, and it was. I mean, if you go and read it now, it's quite outdated, and it's kind of group selection-y in a way that we wouldn't, most people today wouldn't buy into. But it really intrigued me, and so I wrote an undergraduate paper. It was a small seminar class where we had to write a term paper, and I wrote my term paper. It was called Dominance/Access to Women, where I talked about the only reason that men want to gain status is to get sexual access to women. And I brought in, the primatological evidence and, other things. So it was really my first exposure, even before that, as an undergraduate, when I was a freshman, to evolutionary theory in a geology class. And I just thought, whoa, it never even had occurred to me, given my limited mind and limited education, that there existed theories that could explain the origins of things. Right. And that just absolutely fascinated me. And so I was very interested in astronomy and in particular cosmology, the origins and evolution of the universe. And then with our species, the origins and evolution of humans, and in particular our evolved psychology. So it kind of goes way back. And then, so then I found in a used bookstore, I found a collection of articles on sexual selection theory that had Trivers' chapter in it. I read Don Simon's 1979, The Evolution of Human Sexuality. I read George Williams had a book called Sex and Evolution. And so I started, and talk about like a broad-minded scholar. Most psychologists, as you know, don't know anything about evolutionary theory. But, and there's not a single, to get a BA or a BS or a PhD in at least in, I don't know if this is true in Canada, but in America, you don't need to take a single course in evolutionary biology.
Amazing.
And so people, all of these professors have, most of them, unless they get it on their own,
right,
they have little or no knowledge of what the actual technical details are of evolutionary theory.
And what's incredible is if you were, quote, an animal behaviorist of any kind, or a zoologist, or a primatologist, so for every other species, 1,999,999, you would never study the behavior of the mating strategies of the salamander without invoking evolutionary thinking. But somehow there's this one species that is you could completely study. You could be called Dr. So-and-so without ever invoking biology. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I'll actually tell you a story about that, an anecdote. Now, because didn't you, one of your degrees is from Cornell, is that?
Two of my degrees are from Cornell.
Okay, so this is a story. Back in 1990, so this is how long ago this was, I got invited to Cornell to the psych department to give a talk. And so it was one of the first talks I gave on the 37 cultures study. So
let me just fill in for people who don't, well, rather than let me fill in, why don't you tell us what that study is, because it is, of course, the classic study in the field. Go ahead. Tell us that before you go on with the anecdote.
Okay. So, this was a study that, as I was reading in the evolutionary literature, Robert Trivers, Don Simons, George Williams, there were clear predictions, about sex differences in mate preferences that these theories made, and I thought, well, I could actually test these. It's rare in psychology that you actually have a theory that's testable in a cogent way. So I started dabbling in it and tested them on a sample of Cambridge individuals. I was at Harvard at the time. I found the sex differences, which I was delighted by, but I thought, well, no one's going to believe these. If the evolutionary hypotheses are correct, you have to document these across cultures. And so that's what launched the 37 culture study, where over the course of 5 years, I enlisted collaborators from around the world, and we eventually had over 10,000 individuals, 37 different cultures, and found, lo and behold, that these sex differences were in fact universal, as precisely as predicted. One anecdote on that study is that before I did this study, I went around to different professors and asked them to make predictions. I say, look, I found these sex differences in Cambridge. Do you think they're going to be universal or just true in capitalist cultures? And almost every single one said, no, these are just products of capitalism, Western culture. You won't find them elsewhere. The only exceptions were people like Don Simons, who expected them to be universal. But my mistake was I didn't get people to sign their names to the predictions. So because after I published the study, then people say, "Oh, I could have told you that."
That's the fourth. Bias. That's the fourth stage of Haldane, right? It's remember the stages before you accept something. Oh, this is garbage. This is perverse. This is bullshit. Oh, I always said so.
Right.
Okay, so go back to the Cornell story.
Okay, so back to the Cornell story. So here I give my lecture, which is 50 minutes, and then there's the Q&A. And the second I stop, a professor there, and I don't know if you knew her when you were at Cornell, what is her name? Sandy Bem.
The wife of Daryl Bem.
Yeah, the wife of Daryl Bem. Her whole thing was sexual script theory, where somehow culture gives you the script, and that's it all. Anyway, she jumped up from her chair and launched into this monologue about how it was all wrong and how evolution had nothing to do with this. And so she, after like a few minutes of this tirade, I kind of cleared my throat to start to answer. And she said, "You've been talking for 50 minutes. It's my turn now." And then continued to launch into this monologue. But anyway, she finally stopped. And so I said precisely the point that you were alluding to. I said, so you have this theory that explains sex differences in thousands and thousands of species, including sex role reverse species.
Exactly.
And then we get to humans and we find the same sex differences, and you want to invoke an entirely different explanation for the human case compared to the thousands of other species. And she said yes. And so I said, at that point, I think we're probably not going to make too much progress in furthering this discussion.
Well, I mean, at several points today, you spoke about something that I'm really trying to popularize. And I know that, independently, I've been using this epistemological tool, but you've also written about it. Your student, David Schmidt, has written about it. Of course, the granddaddy, Charles Darwin, did it without calling it a name, where you bring in multiple lines of evidence across time, across culture, across disciplines, across frameworks, nomological networks of cumulative evidence, which then allows me to drown your endless, hysterical positions with data, right? So I want to prove to you that toy preferences have a sex specificity. I don't have to scream louder than you. I can bring you data from across cultures, from across time periods, from across species, right? Vervet monkeys and rhesus monkeys. I can bring you data from ancient Greece. I can bring you data from cultures that couldn't be any more different than us. I could bring you data from clinical populations where little girls who suffer from congenital adrenal hyperplasia and therefore have masculinized behaviors will exhibit toy preferences that are reversed. So that, which leads me, I'm going to close the loop on when I talked about earlier about the detractors of EP. Of all of the different attacks on EP, they all piss me off. But the one that pisses me off the most is the one that it's just so storytelling, that it's it's unfalsifiable. And I always argue that if you are a good evolutionist, the threshold of evidence that you work under is actually infinitely higher than all the other sciences, but apparently we just kind of sip cognac, smoke a pipe, and just pontificate with post hoc speculation. Does that piss you off as well? I'm sure it does.
Yeah, of course it does. I mean, this is a meme that Stephen Jay Gould created a long time ago, and unfortunately, for people who want to detract, it's an easy way. Oh, I don't even have to pay attention to EP. It's just a bunch of just so stories. So, but it would be kind of astonishing if we were able to publish in the top journals in the field, and they would say, "Oh, yeah, it's just a just story. Let's publish it in Science and Nature and Psychological Review and whatever." So, we know that that's not true. Having said that, though, I would say that there are, as you know, differences in the quality of evolutionary psych research. Like any field, there are good practitioners and bad practitioners, and I wish the bad practitioners would get out so that we just had good practitioners. But in every field, there's that whole range.
Do you think that? So I can't remember. Well, I think it was Richard Dawkins who talked about middle world, right? So the idea is that our brains have evolved to understand phenomena on a particular scale, so that when you bring me to the electronic nano world, I don't know what the hell you're talking about with string theory. I don't know. I'm lost. If you bring me up to cosmological scale, our brains, yours and mine and everybody else has ever existed, doesn't really know how to think about things at that cosmological level. In the same way that an ant doesn't recognize that the Eiffel Tower exists, right? It's at a completely different scale it's reality. So might it be the case that these detractors of EP are succumbing to certain cognitive and emotional biases or obstacles, precisely because our brain has not evolved to understand evolution well? We have these built-in mechanisms against EP.
Yeah. I agree exactly that. And I've written a bit about that our evolved psychology interferes with our ability to understand our evolved psychology.
Okay, very nice.
So and there are those. So there's the time scale issue. So exactly. The point that Dawkins makes is the one that you made, is that we evolved to solve adaptive problems on shorter time scales. So in the here and now, is this parasite or predator or infectious disease coming my way? Is this an attractive mate I want to try to attract right now? Yeah, so Dawkins makes the point that we evolved to solve adaptive problems on short time scales, in seconds, minutes, hours, occasionally days or years. We didn't evolve to understand causal processes that occur in small increments over thousands or millions of years. It's just irrelevant to the problems that we need to solve. And so our evolved psychology, in fact, interferes with our ability to understand our evolved psychology. But there's actually another way in which it does so, I think, and I've written a bit about this, and that's coalitional psychology. So we have a very powerful evolved coalitional psychology that is our group, and then other groups are enemy groups. And unfortunately, this plays out in academia as well as in the political realm, as well as in small group warfare. And so if your group is, let's say, opposed to applying evolutionary theory to the human mind, then you, out of tribal loyalty, your coalitional psychologist is going to say, I'm going to align myself with my group and not go with the scientific evidence. So I don't think we evolved to be dispassionate scientists. Right. And it takes training and years of trying to overcome some of our evolved psychology to get to the point where we can become dispassionate scientists and try to understand the human mind.
Well, and I guess based on what you're saying, I wonder if I could link it to the following. So I don't know if you know the book which I actually cite in The Parasitic Mind by Sperber and Mercier on the theory of our argumentation, right? That we evolved to kind of defend our position. So it kind of fits very nicely with what you're saying, right? So the requirement that scientists be objective and possess epistemic humility and so on, in a sense, goes against the desire for me to defend my position, irrespective of whether new incoming evidence falsifies it. So in a sense, the scientific method forces me to kind of rise above my innate, otherwise biases, right?
Yeah, indeed. And that's why, I mean, I think that, just to give like one example of that, there's, as you know, social role theory, which is kind of a blank slate theory that attempts to explain existing sex differences. But one good attribute of that theory is that it does make a falsifiable prediction, namely that in cultures, sexually egalitarian cultures, the sex differences should diminish or disappear. And what my former student David Schmidt, who you mentioned earlier, and now many others have found that, in fact, in sexually egalitarian cultures, many of the sex differences are larger. So I've occasionally sent these to one of the prominent social role theorists.
I think I know which one.
With the suggestion, like, maybe you want to change your mind or back off on your claims, but no, zero changing of minds. And I'm sure that those people, and it's been said, like, that science advances one death at a time, that the people go to their death still clinging to the view which is now falsified. So
got you. A couple of more questions, if you could oblige me. Do we still have a bit of time? Okay.
Yes.
So on a different note, so you wear many hats. You're obviously a ridiculously prolific researcher. As a matter of fact, I think it is correct to say that the 50 top psychologists alive today, if not in the 20th century or something. I know you're too modest, but am I on the right track? Something to that effect?
Yeah. So I've been cited in a couple of lists of, one of them is the 50 most influential living psychologists. So how they operationalize that, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm happy to be in that group.
Well, and you certainly are deserving of it. Okay, so you've got your scientist hat, you've got your professor's hat. You have another hat, which, in my view, regrettably too few other professors do, which is exactly what we're doing here. You're putting out material for public engagement beyond the few rarefied, highfalutin, anointed ones that we navigate amongst as professors. Which, of course, that's something that is very much in my wheelhouse, because while, yes, I love to publish peer-reviewed papers, I also get very excited when I post something and 100,000 people view it. Not because I'm a narcissist, but because I'm in the business of creating knowledge and disseminating knowledge. I mean, if evolution is a two-step process, survive and mate, well, academia should be a two-step process, create knowledge and spread it. If I only spread it to 8 other people who read it in some peer-reviewed journal, I'm certainly failing at the reproduction of my memes, if you'd like, right?
And I would add to that I think that we have a moral or ethical obligation to disseminate it. So in my case, my salary is in part supported by public taxpayers' money, in the state of Texas, and then through federal funding in part as well. And so why should only the 75 people who subscribe to a particular journal be the beneficiaries of the scientific knowledge we create? We have a moral obligation to disseminate this scientific knowledge to the taxpayers and to the general public.
Okay, so that's looking at that issue from a sort of altruistic perspective, and that's great. That's very noble. But from your forgive the term, from your selfish perspective, do you enjoy each of these different hats equally, or as, for example, your career has progressed, has the amount of enjoyment of one of the hats become so? Let me first answer it for me, and then I'll ask you to answer the same thing. Today, with the velocity at which I can spread knowledge, I've become I still love when I go in. I'm a passionate guy, so I can go up in class in front of 10 people and I will be like a wide-eyed child, and I'll be excited and animated and so on. But in a world of fixed energy and fixed time, sometimes teaching, 22 students in an MBA class seems to be a greater imposition than me doing this chat with you, which hopefully will be watched by 80,000 people, because life is short. So where are you as you navigate through all these different pulls?
Well, I enjoy all of them, and as you mentioned, I mean, time and energy are finite, and we have to make allocation decisions all the time. But I enjoy it a lot. I enjoy the public aspects of it a lot. So and they kind of feed on each other. So a lot of people found out about my work not through the scientific journal. A lot of professors found out about my work by reading The Evolution of Desire, for example, or hopefully my new book,
yes,
When Men Behave Badly, that will reach a wider audience. And so, like, let's say if you're a sociologist or you're a psychologist who studies memory or something like that, you're not going to read the journals I publish in for the most part, but you might pick up a book and say, oh, this topic, human mating or conflict between the sexes, that really interests me. And so a lot of professors have contacted me not because they read the scientific journals, but because they read the books or heard me on a podcast or saw me on TV or whatever. And so I enjoy all aspects of it. I mean, I guess if, but in terms of time taken away, the one thing that I enjoy less now, although I'm not sure I ever enjoyed it, is dealing with reviewers and the revision process in scientific journals.
Yes.
Because that it's a tedious process, which is often results in no incremental improvement in the quality of the paper. Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't, and it's a big time waste. So I enjoy that aspect of publishing less, and probably book writing and doing podcasting and TV more over time, I would say.
2 more questions, and then I'll let you go to your other pursuits. Number one, is there anything, and I'm asking this today because from a selfish perspective, because in my forthcoming book, I have a chapter on sort of the the book is about really a recipe for the good life, although hopefully it won't be too self-helpish. It'll be really rooted in certainly personal anecdotes and the science behind it. One of the chapters is sort of, if you could live your life void of too many serious regrets, then you've certainly lived a successful life. And actually, one of my former professors at Cornell, Tom Gilovich, is the guy who wrote the seminal books on the psychology of regret, the regret of action versus the regret of inaction. And most people regret a lot more in inaction. I never went and became the dancer. I became the accountant because my dad told me to be, and I hate accounting. So if I were to ask you this question, and I say I'm asking it from a selfish perspective because I love to collect these stories that maybe some of them will make it into the book. What would be, if I asked you right here, right now, what are your greatest sources of regret? What would you answer?
Oh, boy. At a professional level?
Either professional or personal. The one that keeps you up at night, gnawing at you because you wish you...
Well, there aren't any of those.
Okay, good.
So I don't really have any regrets professionally. I mean, I've been very fortunate in that my job allows me the freedom to pursue whatever topics I want. So like no one in graduate school was studying mating. None of my professors did. No one was evolutionary. But I have the freedom to pursue these topics, or if I'm interested in why people murder each other, I can go study that, or status. And so I feel very fortunate in having the freedom to do that. And so I don't really have any professional regrets. I do think evolutionary psychology is a scientific revolution that I wish, and maybe this is a regret, was happening a lot more quickly than it is, and so that's something.
But that's not due to anything. If anything, you've done to not have that happen, so you can't really regret it on a personal level.
Right. So at a personal level, I regret I made a bad mating mistake once.
The mating guru failed at mating.
Yeah. Well, I made it before I started studying mating, and I've never made it again since then. But yeah, my first marriage, I think, was a mistake at one level, but I don't regret it because it actually resulted in 2 children who I love very dearly. And so, from an evolutionary perspective, there's no regrets. It just turned out to be a relationship that imploded over time.
Got it. Okay, last. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but as you said, you've gotten wonderful children from it. So, I mean, you're well on your way to having lived a great life. You have no other regrets. Great job. Last question, more than a question, it's an opportunity. Are there any other projects that you're currently working on that you'd love you'd like to use this forum to promote a next book that you're thinking about, other papers, other projects, anything else, this is your time to promote away beyond this current great book.
Well, these are, as you know, books are long-term projects. So, but the two of the topics I'm currently working on and may eventually publish books on, but probably scientific articles in the meantime. One is, we've already mentioned, is the psychology of status,
right.
Status and reputation, and that I think is a topic that is starting to get more attention, but there's a lot that we don't know. And so I've published a couple articles with Pat Durkee, one of my current graduate students, on that. And I think it's a really important and understudied topic. And then the other is maybe not as grand in scope, but the study of sexual morality. And the idea there is that there's been, as you know, an explosion of research and theories of morality in humans, the evolution of morality, but almost none of them deal with sexual morality. But if you go back to the first written laws, so the law of Hammurabi,
of course.
You go to every major religion, every legal system, wherever they all have dictates about who can have sex with whom, who can have sex with whom, under what conditions you can and can't have sex with whom, who can you marry, who you can't marry, etc. And so sexuality and mating permeate human morality, but our current theories of morality have tended to ignore them.
Right.
You know, they view morality as all about cooperation, and that may be true as well, but there's some specificity to our sexual morality that I think really requires exploration. And so we're right now doing cross-cultural studies. This is with Kelly Asau, a former graduate student, and Courtney Crosby, a current graduate student. We're exploring these across cultures. So I think there'll be some cool stuff coming out.
I'm working with a evolutionary psychologist who used to be a former student of Tubi and Cosmides on also cross-cultural aspects of morality. So we should talk about that in the
cool.
Privately. You mentioned Hammurabi before I close today's chat. In the Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, my first book, I have a section in the first chapter where I take some of the specific edicts from Hammurabi's code and I demonstrate their evolutionary roots. So you might want to go back and check that out. It is such a pleasure and honor to have you with me. I look forward to the three-peat the next time that you'll come on the show. A real pleasure. Stay on the line so we can say goodbye offline. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Gad. It's wonderful talking to you too.
Thank you, sir.